Trent. Thank you. Amazing. Thank you. So then, without further ado, if we could call on the Prime Minister to start this round off.
Hey, am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. One important point of framing before I go more into the content of my speech, this House believes that motion. Why is this important? Because opposition cannot counterprop. They cannot say, let's do both. Let's have both patents and a cash prize. Opposition have to defend the status quo. Happy to put this off the table. Great. With this being said, 3 things in my speech. Firstly, our model. Then why we're going to create cheaper drugs that are going to be more affordable to people. And lastly, why we get better development and research into new innovative drugs under our side of the table. Firstly, our model. Few crucial things about the model. Firstly, we are going to obviously still do safe testings to the drugs, right? We're not going to give a cash prize to any drug that might be effective but unsafe. We're going to still get it across the safety mechanisms of the state. Secondly, we're only going to give the drugs, we're only going to give the cash prize to the first one who created it. That is, we're still going to obviously try to incentivize innovation. We're not going to give the cash prize to anyone who recreated the same existing drug, but only to the first one who actually created something new. Thirdly, in terms of amount of money, this is obviously going to vary according to the type of drug. We're going to have a committee that is going to decide based on how necessary is the medicine as well as how costly it is to produce it. So for an instance, we're going to have people to take into consideration, people who are experts from the field, pharmaceuticals, etc., that are going to estimate how much it costs to research and develop into the development of a new drug, and they are going to offer a much higher price pool than the cost of development, say twice as much or so. And in addition, if we are going to see that the price isn't enough, that is, if we offer the price that is too low and for a long while no one tried to develop the drug, we're going to increase the price. Yes, we're biting the bullet that they are probably going to profit from the price less than they do from the ability to monopolize and gain so much money from the people, but they're still going to earn enough for it to cover the expenses and not be a waste of money to research. Any clarifications? Go.
Is this going to be given to individuals or corporations?
Depending on the contract, honestly, if individuals have developed it and have signed the contract with the company that they are working for, that they are giving up their rights for the profit, whatever, such as happens in universities, often we're going to pay the companies. If they maintain the rights or the legal rights for what they created themselves, we're going to pay them. Cool. Any other clarifications? Awesome, let's get to the point. Cheaper drugs, what is the problem today? We think that generally medicines tend to be very expensive, especially the ones that are most needed. There are several reasons to this. We see this in many examples, such as insulin, which is currently ruining many people's lives by needing to actually get a mortgage or in order to pay for it. Why is this the case? Firstly, quite the obvious, there is a sort of a monopoly, right? At the point at which you get patents for drugs, and these patents in most countries today tend to be very lengthy, such as in the United States, you have it for 25 years of a patent right. And again, I flag here, opposition need to defend the status quo. There's no counterprop of just decrease the time. It means that we have so much time in which you have a monopoly in the market. No one can compete with you. When there's no competition, you have a higher ability to raise the prices. But wait, opposition might say, but obviously you want it to be affordable because you want people to buy it. But here's a unique thing about medicine, unlike other products. People would pay literally anything within their power to get it. At the point at which it is an issue of life and death, or at least an issue of very severe life consequences and life quality, people are going to be willing to give up on many things to pay for it. This is exactly why we see people doing double jobs, selling main things in their quality of life, giving up on their college tuition or whatever in order to afford this. This means that yes, it is technically affordable. That is, companies do have the incentive to make it cheap enough in order for you to be technically able to pay for it, but as expensive as they can insofar as your actual limitless abilities, right? Insofar as you're able to sell something to get it, you will do that, and they know it, meaning that they have a captive audience, leading to them continuously increasing the prices over and over again, because no one is going to prioritize anything else over the literal lives. Specifically, why do we solve it under our side of the debate? 2 reasons for this. Firstly, just the fact that we inherently create competition, right? At the point at which there is no patent, and there are many different pharmaceutical companies that are able to compete in the market immediately and don't need to wait for 25 years, we have so much more competition that will lead to lower prices. But secondly, the fact that it is so much cheaper to recreate something than it is to develop. At the point at which we are making this non-patented, and you're able to just copy it and recreate versus using reverse engineering, it is so much cheaper to do so when you don't need to pay for the lab facilities, etc., meaning that we are likely to see very cheap drugs drugs know that most drugs that are so expensive today are not that expensive to produce, but only to develop. So at the point at which we do this, we think that they're going to be very affordable. Now, let's do some weighings on why this is important in this debate, okay? So we think that obviously if it is not affordable, I don't care even if people are going to develop less medicines in the first place. We want the medicines that we do have to be affordable. Otherwise, people are either dying or ruining their lives to get it because they are now needing to sell many things that are important for their livelihood. But let's do some actual comparative weighings here. Two main things that I want to flag in comparison of this, even if we will bite the bullet of less development on our side, though we do think we have more development on our side. Firstly, we think that our ability to subsidize the research is actually bigger than the ability to subsidize the medicines, because there is not a limit to how expensive a drug can be. The reason why most of these drugs, such as insulins, are not being subsidized today is because, according to this monopoly that I just analyzed, if you know that the state is going to pay for it, you're just going to increase the prices higher and higher and higher, meaning that you're not able as a state to subsidize it. Whereas to pay for the research facilities and universities is actually affordable. So we think that on the trade-off, it is preferable, even if we lose some research. But we'll also analyze why we think we get better research and development under our side. What doesn't change under the debate and what does change? What doesn't change? Firstly, we think that what doesn't change is the fact that you want to make a new medicine just to get the prize, right? We think that people want to get the prize money because it is profitable. Secondly, you want to make a new medicine and new research for the brand, because in general, when you develop more stuff, it means that your company has a better brand that people want to buy from. Before I move on, I'd like to take closing extension.
Governments are made up of politicians and popular leaders, not scientists. They're notoriously anti-science. They deny climate change.
Thanks. I literally said, like, there is obviously committee, like we see in most offices of healthcare today, like they're going to be made of scientists, even if the governments themselves are anti-science. Great. So we think that there is going to be a lot of incentive to still develop. What does change, however? You are more able to develop things based on existing drugs, right? At the point at which you are able to use the existing mechanism, but improve it, add tweaks on it, you are better able to create better and more effective drugs that increase development and create better drugs for everyone. But secondly, the fact that you have more of an incentive to develop now because you cannot live off your existing cash cow. The problem is that today, if you have invented something such as a medicine for cancer, you're earning so much money from this being a monopoly that you don't need to actually take the further risk of trying to develop something new because no point for it. But at the point at which you only got the cash prize once, and now you want to earn more money and you cannot continue milking the existing cash cow, you have more of an incentive to develop even further. But lastly, small businesses. At the point at which I am able to copy and through reverse engineering actually sell an existing drug, which is more accessible to me as a new small pharmaceutical than it is for actually creating the facility to develop, I can get a leg in the market and actually get the initial step that I need in order to now become an actual developer that will lead me to be able to develop stuff in the future. Beg you to propose.
Thank you. And now calling upon the leader of the opposition.
Can I be heard and seen?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Okay. The opening government wanted to make this debate about insulin and how people in America cannot afford insulin. Note that this debate is not a retroactive debate that can go back and change the price of insulin, which already exists and is already crippling people. But also note that this debate doesn't only take place in a really fucked up medical system like the US, where the government does not help individuals with their drug prices and does not subsidize them and help individuals who cannot afford drugs to get drugs. Most importantly, this debate is actually about developing new drugs, because it is about implementing this new cash price system in place of the patent system. And crucially, in today's day and age, what is most important is developing things like the COVID vaccine, is developing things like cures for rare diseases that currently have no cure. Note that in today's world, most existing very common diseases and lifestyle diseases like insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes already do have a cure and are thus not really relevant in this debate. The most important concern, therefore, is not driving down the prices for existing drugs, although we're going to tell you why we can also use the similar political capital to do that in a more effective way, but is the incentive to develop new drugs and better drugs and drugs that cure diseases that do not yet have a cure, so that we can actually save people's lives. Okay, the government wanted to say that we can't counterprop both systems where we both have the cash reward and the patent. What we are going to defend, though, is we are going to have the existing status quo patent system, but given that the government has the fiat and the power to like conjure up this enormous amounts of money to give to these countries to incentivize research, similar amounts of money can be used to prop up the government's own research institutions, for example, in public universities, or in situations where the current medical system, like in the US, is really fucked up, they can use that to compensate people and subsidize people's drug prices and like make their insulin cheaper and make the prices that people pay for these new drugs also cheaper, like what we do in Australia. Government can also use that money to engage in collective bargaining with the pharmaceutical industry, like what Bernie Sanders is proposing in Medicare for All. So what we're going to tell you is, first of all, the money that the government has to defend giving to these pharma companies or giving to these research teams as a reward is going to be extremely high, because the government wants to say that, oh, it's going to go like double cover the costs of development and that's it. But that is not going to incentivize these companies to actually develop these drugs, right? A lot of the time, the reason why these drug prices are so high in the first place is because these drugs are for very limited numbers of patients, and these companies need huge incentives to develop these drugs at all, because it's not going to be because since the market is already saturated and most diseases that a lot of people have and need drugs like insulin have a solution already. So for these drug companies to be incentivized to develop new drugs, the compensation has to be extremely high. So with that money, we think we can do a lot more. We can accomplish things like drive down prices, like get the drug quickly, like get a good drug, by putting that money into public university R&D and doing things like collective negotiations and putting up something like the pharmaceutical benefits scheme to help people get drugs cheaper. That is a more direct way of helping people and actually guarantees that people who are vulnerable are able to get those drugs. Why is our counterprop better? First of all, we get drugs a lot quicker. We get drugs for these rare diseases and things like the COVID vaccine a lot quicker and a lot more effectively. This is because patents are more of an incentive to research drugs compared to this cash prize for two reasons. First of all, cash price is not going to, as the government admits, match the profits of patents, right? With the company, they earning money by having a patent, they are able to set their own prices and are able to offset the R&D costs and are able to control how much money they are earning, and are also able to get money from the government in places where governments actually purchase the drugs for the people and don't allow drug companies to fuck over people. So drug companies are able to get a lot of that money because they're incentivized by the patent. Crucially, though, however, given that the government's model is that only the first company who is going to get to the cure for this disease is going to get this cash prize, there's just going to be not as many companies working towards getting that prize compared to in the current system, and you can patent different mechanisms to solve the same problem. And as long as you are using a different mechanism, like going to a different DNA or RNA, or like using a different mechanisms for the drug, you are able to patent both, and both of the solutions might have different effects. In that case, companies are a lot more likely to sink money into R&D compared to when you're only going to get that money once, and if you are one day behind the other research team to get this drug, you're not able to get that money. So companies are going to be disincentivized to sink money into R&D to these diseases, and therefore we would likely get these drugs slower because there are just less competitions between these companies, and there is less likelihood that we are going to get these drugs very quickly. Next, we're also going to get more competition on our side because we're putting money into public universities and propping up government research teams. This also means that not only is that added a level of competition with the private sector and now we have two horses racing towards getting the drug quickly, but also if the public university research team is the one who gets to discover the drugs, we can also do things like drive down prices, accomplish the goals that the government wants to accomplish. Second of all, why we get better drugs on our side and a diversity of drugs. Crucially, this is extremely important in situations like the COVID vaccine, right? Because we cannot just rely on one COVID vaccine in case it does not work, or it expires quickly and does not guarantee immunity for the long run, or it is incompatible with existing manufacturing supply chains. So we need multiple options, and we need to incentivize a diversity of something like a COVID vaccine or a vaccine for a future pandemic. Why does our side get incentivize this sort of diversity? First of all, when the government puts money into its own R&D, it can invest in things that are not immediately profitable for the drug company. So for example, for extremely rare diseases, the cash reward is unlikely going to incentivize the company to sink huge amounts of R&D into that disease, even though if it's extremely important to people like cystic fibrosis or some sort of other rare disease that not a lot of people have. So government R&D is able to ensure that there is a diversity of research and still teams working on those kinds of drugs to help those kinds of vulnerable people. But most importantly, there is more of an incentive for companies to still pursue drugs with a patent system when there is already an available cure. As I said, as I've mechanized before, when there is only one cash prize for the first person to go across the finish line, companies are unlikely going to continue, first of all, start their efforts to develop a drug because for fear they are not going to be the first, but second of all, continue their efforts beyond the other company already getting the cash prize because they know they can still get a different patent and still be able to monopolize a smaller sector of that market. For things like the COVID vaccine, for things like cures for dangerous diseases that threaten people's lives, we get better outcomes. Very proud to oppose.
Cool, thank you. And now calling upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Can you hear me well?
Try one more time.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Cool. Just a second. Three, two, one. Whole opening opposition line relying on premise that they have a fiat to make the funding to universities and other places. If we will have the speaker briefing for this competition, that will be definitely covered, that this is not their role and they should defend the status quo and also the current existing patent law. But at best, their counterprop is not mutually exclusive. We can also fund universities and other places. It's unclear for me what is their stance. But I wanted to engage line by line what they bring to this debate. They rebut the only insulin example. They never touch the analysis which Hadar provided. But second of all, they said, yeah, this is already bad, but we are talking about the future. What we are saying, we don't want to follow the system in which even if we will create the particular drugs, they will be so high prices that that people can't afford that. Therefore, they can't save lives. They only can put to the pockets for the rich people, which is extremely unequal in the society. Therefore, we wanted to look for the long term and to not follow the mistakes which was done before, especially when we have a lot of lobbying currently and these companies have a massive amount of power. So we need to find the other solution. Then they said, COVID. This is the time-sensitive issue, right? We are seeing that many countries can't afford even tests. Some Southeast Asian countries like Taiwan or other places have massive amount of tests and they can cure COVID much earlier. In Poland or Eastern Europe or in Venezuela or Brazil, you can't even buy tests. Look about the vaccines. You don't have patent law which will expire, and if will someone incentivize the particular drug, then you can copy that and then you can distribute that in your regions and give to your people. Therefore, COVID is definitely for our side and any future epidemic, pandemic, or whatever will happen, because people will be capable to do that in the regions and with their own resources, because every country have the R&D center and their own diseases and their own problems. Therefore, the incentives will not change, but the ability to get cheaper drugs and to increase the utility and have better research and development in these current places is definitely on our side of the house. Then they said that they will cure more rare diseases. Is no analysis whatsoever why they will be not only curing the most popular diseases and the most vocal one. I believe that countries in Asia or Africa when they have different types of diseases which not everyone in the world know, and they can't develop their research centers because the patent law for 20 years doesn't allow them to get this to their testers, have much more better knowledge, or like smaller companies, about the direct problem which is happening, right? So maybe you will have for the most prominent diseases, but at best you never say why you will create the cheaper drugs or why they will be affordable for people which you want to cure. What we are saying that increasing the competition and give less reliance on the Western, like developed world countries, increase the ability for people in these particular regions to weaponize and to utilize their research and development centers much better. But then they said, oh, less likelihood to get quickly, even if you buy this, which Hadar already preempt that you will still have massive incentives because you still want to be first on both sides of the house, and the price will be beneficial. We already told you about the high prices and R&D centers, but I wanted to be very, very direct now. Why incentives still will be present? 3 reasons for that. A, the life prolonging healthcare is extremely important and pumped this issue by the governments, by the media, and by the business. That conclusion is that this always is demand because of the climate change, because of a lot of viruses and a lot of places. If you already have research center, if you already have enough technology, where these businesses will go, or like why they will stop. This is universal solution. Therefore, every company needs to follow this and need to change their ability to the price system, right? So you still want to be the best, you still want to compete, you still want to have good brand because probably your company also have like technological research or like in other fields, right? Therefore, it's unclear where they will go if this business will be still lucrative. Even if you little bit take down the scale, people still stay there and still want to do good things. Therefore, the conclusion is we slightly gave them less money or like less profit, but we open the market, which will be available for smaller research centers. We increase the competition, and therefore the prices need to be competitive on the market and not dictated by the one huge giant, especially in terms of vaccine, especially by all of the examples which opposition bring to this debate. Before I move on to monopolization, closing quickly.
Yes, if the products you're making are no longer profitable, that is, you don't make any money, even if you don't have anywhere to go, investors and stockholders will just stop putting money into your company and it will go bankrupt, even if you have no alternative industry in which to go to.
Yeah, and here is the problem. You don't listen to me. These people will not go away because it's life prolonging issue. It's the healthcare. It's something which stopped business in the whole world for like fucking year almost already, right? This is something which always you will be waiting for finding the new cure, which always will be demand on the market and always will be pressure to solve this. Also from the government, also from the media, and also from the market. Therefore, even if you first time lost this price, that's like it's a lot of patents available, the same will be a lot of different prices available, and people wanted to aim to this, especially when we have a lot of problems. So it's unclear for me why after you didn't win one prize, you completely drop out other things. But also, even if you don't win this prize, look that you don't need to wait and pump millions in R&D, but you can't take the ready product, use that to your research now and try to win another prize with less amount of investments, which will be beneficial for shareholders. But even if not this by you, still you can distribute your products, right? You still can copy some kind of this, you still can improve this because you don't have patent law, which means that people keep monopoly and you can use that in the short term so you can increase capacity better, right? So panel, the weighing is this. On our side of the house, you increase the capacity of developing world and smaller centers and smaller companies to enter the pharmaceutical market and to actually be capable to utilize the resources which normally are frozen and only available to the big players. The conclusion of this is, on our side of the house, if you will create these drugs and if they will be available, and we give you multiple reasons why they still will be happening, people will be capable to buy this without selling their souls, without overworking themselves, and without getting high mortgages because they will have no influence on the prices. On their side of the house, it's extremely hard to balance this on looking at this. If you look, what is the goal of these drugs and what is the goal of the healthcare system or pharmaceuticals? It's giving people the cure and being accessible. We stand for that. We gave you 2 mechanisms: not engaged,
Great, thank you. Now calling up the deputy leader of the opposition.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Government team is living in a fantasy world. What am I going to do for you in this speech? First on framing, secondly on why governments are bad actors, thirdly on why high drug prices are necessary, fourthly on, lastly on worse medicines. First, let's get two pieces of framing out of the way. I think the first piece of framing is that what Vivian tells you from her speech, right? This debate takes place in a world where the patents on most drugs have already expired. Insulin is an unfortunate example. We're willing to bite that there are a few examples of that in the status quo, but I think we live in a world where modern technology has made it so that people's lives are extended infinitely from how long they were expected to live 50 or even 60 years ago. I think they're underestimating the strides made in modern technology. Secondly, I think the important thing for Opt to win is that it's more important for us to have life-saving medicines available in the first place, as opposed to these individuals having no hope, even if these drugs are a little bit more expensive. Few pieces of one piece of extraneous rebuttal. They say that this is going to empower small countries and developing nations. I simply think this is going to be untrue, because they cannot compete with the big players anyway, because they are not the big pharmaceutical companies that have hundreds and hundreds of scientists working for them, that they have the labs and technology needed to conduct large-scale clinical trials. I simply don't understand on their side they magically get the capacity to be able to compete for these cash prizes. Now, on why governments are not reliable actors. A few mechanisms under this, right? First, most are just like quite poor. This doesn't just take place in rich countries, right? This also takes place in Bangladesh, where corruption is rampant. This also takes place in China, where corruption is also rampant. This takes place in countries that are in Southeast Asia and all over the world. I think that they don't even, given that these countries don't even have enough for welfare, it is unlikely the compensation for these pharmaceutical companies are going to be high at all. I'm going to talk about that impacts later on. Secondly, oftentimes, right now in the status quo, we're facing an economic crisis. We don't have enough, governments already buying up, governments and central banks already buying up debt en masse. We simply don't have the capacity to continue to fund these medical innovations. Thirdly, a lot of governments are quite corrupt, right? So it is a case in many ministries where you have a direct friend in the pharmaceutical industry. You have a friend who is working in a hospital. You have these friends who are able to try to corrupt you and try to bribe you and say, look, I think you should give the patient or give the cash prize to my company, even though they have not passed through all the testing necessary. Because oftentimes in these places, in many developing nations, health regulations are quite lax and drug regulations are pretty simple to get through. So I think this also leads to the influx of worse drugs in the market that have a lot of adverse health effects because of the in-bed relationship these pharmaceutical industries often have with direct friends in the government. Lastly, I think even in good democracies, right, this is going to lead to a lot of market inefficiency. Why is this the case? Because a lot of politicians, once they get into power, they have their own interests, right? Whether or not you believe a disease is important like AIDS, Republicans are never going to think that AIDS is important, and they're never going to fund any amount of money into AIDS research. AIDS was stigmatized for decades on end, and gay people kept dying in droves because nobody thought it was a real disease, or nobody thought it was a disease that was morally worthy of saving. So I think that if you have a government like that, if you have a government that has the potential to be quite conservative or have regressive social value on what kinds of disease ought to be treated, I think that we shouldn't let the government make these kind of decisions and maybe make the vaccine for AIDS be super cheap, and nobody wants to invest in that end. I think oftentimes it is better for the free market to decide, because as long as there's a demand for it, that means people will buy it, and that means these companies will profit. The market and people's actual needs don't play these weird conservative value games. Okay, next, on why high drug prices are often necessary, and I think this is incredibly important because it basically clashes with all of the opening government case. Let's just talk about the process of developing a drug in the first place, right? It looks like recruiting talent. It looks like trying to get really promising medical students into your company when they were really promising biochemistry students into your company when they could have just gone into medical school and made a lot of money as a doctor. So the compensation of keeping these people around to work as researchers for you is incredibly high. Even though the research process takes decades on end and you're never going to see the profit, you need these people around to fund your company in the first place, which means you're paying millions of dollars to these individuals every single year, even though there's no no return. Secondly, it also looks like very, very robust clinical trial systems, right? The average vaccine takes like 20 years to develop. The fact that we're trying to make a COVID vaccine in the matter of 2 or 3 years is already inhumane, right? It looks like them trying to, it looks like these companies trying to pay for the entire process, even though they know that this might fail and they have to bear all of the cost. All of the cost sinks and is eaten by the company, the hundreds of millions of dollars wasted on a drug that never turned out to be effective in the first place. That is the burden they need to shoulder. Secondly, also people sue for adverse effects, either during clinical trials or even after, when they maybe have a few symptoms and they're really rich and they want to sue the company, right? All of this means is that the company sinks decades of research into the development process of even one drug. Oftentimes, the 1 or 2 patents a company has is the only thing that is keeping them afloat. The fact that they're charging prices is not just to like line the pockets of the CEOs, right? Oftentimes, it is to make sure that there's enough capital going around so the company can exist in the first place. Why can manufacturing not fix this in any world? One, I think that if everybody can manufacture because there are no patents, then every company will want to manufacture, which increases competition and actually drives the manufacturing price down to the bottom, and you're not going to make any profit from that. It's always going to be worse off on their side. And added, given all the government framing I've already given you, right? In many countries, they don't even have enough to make the cash price happen in the first place to be enough to compensate these companies, so that you basically have no capital going into these pharmaceutical companies. What is the terminal impact of all of this? You just make the pharmaceutical industry not good enough to continue onward. Before I go on, I'll take a point from CG.
Cool. So right now, pharmaceutical companies can charge whatever they want for their patented drugs, so they only target issues that affect rich people. That's why we have exponentially more research on erectile dysfunction and hair loss than mesothelioma. When the metric is saving lives, we change that.
Okay, so there's a wide variety of players in the market, right? It is not only the big shots of pharmaceutical companies who want to charge rich people. When there are smaller companies who cannot compete with them on those grounds, these smaller firms, the middle-sized firms, can also develop those drugs as well. I think there's already a market ability for us to fix these things, because there not only one kind of pharmaceutical company exists in the status quo. Look, I think that this collapses the entire pharmaceutical industry when there's no incentive to manufacture either rich people drugs or poor people drugs or whatever drugs have you. Lastly, on why you get worse medicines, and I think this is a huge impact coming out of VIV that was never responded to by any member of Gov. What is the argument here? If you don't have any patents, if you're only giving the cash price to the person who first comes up with the drug, the first iteration of these drugs, you have no incentive to improve, because you can never earn money from the development or recreation or making the drugs better. And this is really important, right? Because most drugs are not 100% effective. Most drugs, the first iteration of that drug is incredibly poor. Like Fauci says that if we get a COVID vaccine that is even 50% effective, that will be already really, really good for us. When you only offer incentives for companies to manufacture 30% effective, 40% effective drugs, and then say, okay, because you're the first mover, you're the only one who gets this money, then you stop all future innovation of making sure people don't die from adverse effects. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you. And now calling upon the member of government. And now calling upon the president.
All right, can everyone hear me? I'm assuming you can. All right, in that case, I'm going to begin. We're not going to be so extreme as OO, who makes big claims without warrants that every drug that every pharmaceutical company produces will just stop getting produced and all research will halt. We concede that in government's best case, maybe they might make drugs for common illnesses like the flu or diabetes more affordable. But in the process, they halt all research and development into drugs that help people with orphan and rare illnesses, illnesses that disproportionately affect people in the third world and poor people, and incremental improvements to drugs, i.e. those that do not have a government incentive or ability to properly fund over an extended period of time. That will be our extension. Before that, I want to deal with CG's extension. First thing they talk about is that people hoard patents ad infinitum. This is just not true. Patents expire after about 10 to 15 years. They're just lying to you on that. When they say that some companies that have had patents for 50 years, that is because the company has made reasonable improvements to that drug over that 50 years. Trent says they're just patenting new processes. But Trent, those processes are good things. They're making the drug sometimes cheaper to produce or easier to produce in a low-tech facility, for example. We think it's a good thing that companies are continually improving drugs, and they need the patents to secure that research and development. Otherwise, they'll just stop improving it. If what Trent says is true and that companies are just doing patent tricks and they're inventing new patents without actually having any useful new innovation, then won't competitors just use the old version of the drug where the patent is already expired and works just as well? His argument doesn't make sense. The second thing they talk about is that the market doesn't solve and that poor people never get drugs that help them, like for mesothelioma, asbestosis, produce. That because poor people cannot afford the drugs, pharmaceutical companies don't have incentive to produce it. First thing I want to say is that the poor people, maybe they can't afford the drugs, but they don't pay for the drugs. In the vast majority of cases, their insurers do. This is the comparative that OO missed. The comparative in our world is not poor people cannot afford anything, is that insurance companies shoulder the burden of these drugs rather than having the government's cash prize shoulder this burden. Recognize that in the US, everyone under the federal poverty line is covered by Medicaid, so the people that CG cares about the most are literally already covered in status quo. Now, even if insurers are not perfect, look at the comparative. Government cash prizes. Are they really going to create a political will to solve these rare diseases that only affect poor people when you've already characterized them as so anti-poor people? The second thing I want to talk about is about people in developing countries and why we're on the comparative better for them, right? The US pays 0.01% of their GDP to foreign aid. Italy turns away boatfuls of refugees. Do you really think that in Gov's world, the Gov is going to give any cash prize to a disease that only affects people in the developing world? They're not going to care about tropical illnesses that like malaria or dengue, which only affect people in the developing world because they're located around the equator. They're probably going to focus the cash prize on those that affect continental Europe and America. Patents, on the other hand, are far better for access and development of drugs that affect people uniquely in developing countries. Because first of all, there's a big profitable market in the developing world. Each person might be quite poor, but collectively they're quite well off. And I also want to point out that many developing world countries have universal health insurance, like Vietnam. Okay, let's talk about our case. First thing, how do you halt all research into rare orphan illnesses that affect fewer numbers of people? I want to characterize this as a big problem because even though each individual illness or each individual poor country, like localized illness, only affects a small number of people, collectively they probably make up the majority of the world. What this policy does is it sets a ceiling on how much companies are willing to spend on pharmaceutical research for these drugs. The ceiling is the price that is set by the government as the cash prize. And this is a mechanism I think OO missed. The reason why it's a ceiling is because the price of the drug in our world is the one that helps to recoup the losses made in the research stage, and they can do that because of the patent. In your world, the price of drug is likely to be very low and set by other companies who did not have to spend on the research and therefore can set the price of the drug at a very low point. So companies have no incentive to invest in research where the cash prize is going to be lower than how much the other companies would set the drug's price as at. So it really affects the cases where the cash prize is very small. Now, what are those cases? There are cases where it affects a few number of people, orphan illnesses or rare conditions that only affect maybe 500 people in America. But remember, there are many of them, so collectively they might affect tens of thousands of people. The reason why the cash prize set by the government will be very low is that there's simply no majority demanding it. OG says, well, people always care about healthcare. They will always have political will for it. Whose healthcare do they care about? Their own. So they only care about the flu vaccine or COVID vaccines. They don't care about rare illnesses that do not affect them or any of their family members. The people who suffer from them often cannot organize into coherent lobby group because they're really sick and also because they're very ill or vulnerable, in some cases poor for those who suffer from asbestosis or mesothelioma. And therefore they cannot lobby the government to increase the cash prize for a drug that could save their life. As a result, these people are fucked over when pharmaceutical companies just stop doing research into all of these categories of illnesses. It collectively affects many people and the drug doesn't get produced at all. The comparative is that patents far better protect the intellectual property of companies who know that they can benefit from this niche market and therefore continue to do research into it. So let's do a bit of weighing here on the affordability of drugs. In both worlds, pharmaceutical research is not getting any cheaper. The question is just, where do we place the burden? Gov wants to place the burden of this expensive research on governments and taxpayers. We say they won't want to shoulder the burden for those rare illnesses, so those rare illnesses will get shoved under the carpet. We put the burden on health insurance companies who are far more efficient because they can distribute the cost by assessing the risk and spreading it out over their large insurance base. Any POIs? Oh, can I take one from opening, please?
as we analyzed, you can't just subsidize meds either by state or insurance, since there isn't a finite price to those drugs. If subsidy takes place, pharmaceuticals will just increase the price nonstop, unlike a set cash price.
There are laws on price gouging. That is why when Martin Shkreli tried to increase the price of AIDS drugs to $5,000, he was hauled up to Congress and he no longer can do that. Regulations are a far better way to solve the problem of price gouging you're talking about. We see that the cash compensation uniquely harms all of these people that we talked about who don't have government will backing them for cash prizes. So when you weigh it up, why do we prefer perhaps marginally decreasing access for these drugs to people if it means that those drugs get produced in the first place? Because at least the drugs get produced and at least we can find ways to regulate and get access to them. On Gov side, the drugs never get produced in the first place, and you put a halt to any kind of improvement for people who suffer from those conditions. Finally, I just want to say they disincentivize continued research into the illness. OO alluded to it, but they didn't give the mechanisms for it. First, the preset cash price cannot predict how effective a drug will be beforehand. Therefore, for improvements to the drug, people aren't likely to invest in it. The stock market for those kind of pharmaceutical companies just collapses. In their world, drugs get halted at the nascent stage. They never get improved. We're so proud to oppose.
Thank you. And now calling upon the government whip.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yeah.
Oh, the background. I guess the background works. Two things in this speech. Firstly, underserved diseases and underserved populations. Secondly, increasing access overall. Firstly, on underserved diseases and underserved populations, I think the thing to recognize here is that underserved populations are not covered by heavy insurance packages that are willing to cover them for hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of treatment. In many cases, particularly as OO says, these governments don't have enough money or don't have the willingness to provide tons of funding toward poor people that aren't paying for their own insurance. They don't have private insurance because they don't work for like really wealthy employers. And so what that ultimately means is that there is a limitation, especially in many parts of the world where governments are underfunded, for the ability for individuals to pay for their own treatment. That means that someone in sub-Saharan Africa, in Vietnam, in a less economically developed country is not able to pay for their treatment and therefore isn't a viable market. But even if they do have some degree of healthcare, often these are limited by the government as well. They say this is some sort of specialized treatment, isn't covered by the traditional package that we give you with, for example, Medicaid. And for the fact that these insurance packages often have caps. So if it is true, as they say under their side of the house, that these are relatively small populations, then they won't actually get much benefit. But even if they're relatively large populations, if the treatment is expensive because they just had to develop an entirely new medicine for it, then on the market incentives alone, individuals won't be able to pay for this because there's no private subsidization of this. I think that what that means is that the poor people are not a market audience that they're able to get under their side of the house. Then they say, well, look, the US doesn't care about tropical diseases. Firstly, I think that like on the level of fiat, you probably just can't oppose what OG set out, that they would care about things like quality adjusted life years, which is typically what this model would be proposing. It's not just the US government arbitrarily picks some diseases. It's a council of scientists comes together and says, what are the diseases that are most pressing to the world? What are the diseases that are ruining livelihoods and decreasing the number of quality adjusted life years the most in the world? And that's how we allocate spending. But secondly, like I think that we already do have treatments for a lot of diseases. So given the point that we'll discuss later on about like being able to increase access, I think that given that we already have things like treatments for malaria and vaccines for cholera, that's a huge win under our side as well. But thirdly, I think that governments do tend to look good when they help out the poor, right? When they help out needy populations, when they're able to put out ads saying, look, this is the disease that I funded. So I don't think that they get that impact under their side of the house. The crucial thing to note then is that poorer populations are not a market force that incentivizes large companies to go after them, particularly when wealthy individuals are a much larger market force. So if we're relying purely on market incentives, you'll always go after the wealthier populations that can pay not only with government healthcare, but also with their private healthcare, pay out of their own pocket, etc., and be covered in that respect. The next thing that I want to talk about, so why is this important? Why does this outweigh the opening house? Why does this make it a closing debate? Well, because the big issues affecting the poor really do exist, because things like mesothelioma, things like malaria, things like diseases resulting from malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies really do exist and uniquely affect poor populations. They're not just diseases that affect everyone in the world, and they need specific treatment for them. Secondly, there are diminishing returns on drug research, right? So the thing to note here is that doing a little bit more research on a drug that already exists for, like, for example, like hair loss, only creates so much more benefit. Whereas doing the same amount of research, putting the same amount of money into developing a new drug that doesn't exist yet, tends to have greater returns on investment in terms of life quality gained. Thirdly, in principle, government subsidies, which is effectively what they're doing on their side of the house, they're subsidizing medicine just for rich people. Government subsidies should value all people equally. The issue is under their side of the house, government subsidies value a certain group of people more so than other people. And finally, because poor people need treatment more, rich people are more able to do things like palliative care, more able to avoid disease in the very first place because they have preventive care, because they live healthier lifestyles, because they're wealthier and can shield themselves from this. So in principle, the poor need more treatment from the government. The second thing to talk about then is access to medicine, aka do you develop medicine, do you make it accessible? The first thing to talk about is that I think that making medicine accessible is worth the trade-off even if we get less development. Why is this the case? Because most people either can't afford or ruin their lives in trying to afford medicine in the developed world. The reason why is because US medicinal companies develop the vast majority of effective medicinal treatments in the world. What that effectively means is that in countries that don't have extremely robust healthcare systems, and even in countries in many cases that do have robust healthcare systems, getting sick means you pay a heavy, heavy price. This is the vast majority of the people in the world, particularly the poor, particularly those living in less economically developed countries where they can't be covered for these extremely high costs, particularly per OO's analysis that these governments don't have a lot of money. So the crucial thing to note there is that things like insulin, things like malaria treatment, things like vaccines for cholera, treatments we've had for nearly a century now go on to the market. Why should you weigh this over other things? Firstly, on the reasoning of scale, because we can treat more people with diseases that we already know. It is unclear what diseases they're talking about on opposition side that they need to be treated and wouldn't be invested in under their side of the house. Secondly, on time frame, because we can solve this problem right now as opposed to waiting for a drug that might come save people in 20 years. And thirdly, because of certainty, because we know this will work, because we know we have these treatments already, as opposed to their side, which might get some research into potential diseases, but they didn't prove that it's principally justified to have that uncertainty under their side of the house. What did they say? Firstly, they say, well, now you only produce 30% good drugs, and this is repeated by closing. Well, the thing is, if you produce a drug that could be improved massively upon and actually does produce better life quality, then yeah, we're going to pay you more for the drug that is now 70% more effective. If the change under your side, though, is incredibly marginal and doesn't actually change the quality of life of people being affected, then we're not going to actually pay you more. Moreover, on your side, if you produce the 30% drugs and you can patent the processes involved in the 30% drug and prevent anyone else from making 100% drug, that's a really big problem. The second thing that they talk about is, oh, well, patents don't expire unless they're do expire unless they're useful, right? So if a company has a patent right now, that definitely means that they've only had it for a short period of time or that they've done something really, really good with it. No, due to all the spec that Trent gave you, they didn't engage with literally anything that Trent told you about carbon rings, about processes, about improvements, and crucially, about litigation, right? Companies have a huge ability, particularly with lawyeristic power, to just engage in litigation, to say, okay, look, we're gonna sue you for using a process that's roughly similar to ours. They have the ability to say, okay, look, we modified this drug a little bit and use their lawyeristic and sciencey talk to get past that issue. So I think they're able to defend their patents no matter what, ad infinitum. This is a crucial addition to opening house that links in, crucially, to all of their impacts, because their impacts only exist for 20 years. Our impacts exist when insulin is patented by the same company for effectively 100 years. What did they say in terms of development? Firstly, our response is that, look, where is development needed? We told you that needed, especially in diseases that affect the poor, that aren't being invested in right now. But secondly, because universities will still invest in development either way, because they care more about altruism than the general company, because the people that are involved in university research care more about reputation in the field. Thirdly, because you can motivate them with a cash prize. But also, we told you that the greatest cost isn't research in development, it's uncertainty. When you can be sued for trying to produce a drug in the very first place. When we allowed companies to do research without the fear of being sued by Pfizer for violating some obscure patent in the past, then they're able to do research in the very first place. But even if we don't get more research, we treat the poor with drugs that we already have right now. We give generic medicines to these people. That's the most important thing in this debate. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you. And now calling on the opposition whip.
Great. All right. 3, 2, 1, go. The reason insulin is expensive isn't because it's patented. It's existed since the 19th century. It's because it's pretty expensive to produce. Okay, all the stuff that CG tells you about patents doesn't really make a lot of sense for two big reasons. One, if it's this bad, honestly, we just change the system and make it harder to make really, really small changes. What OG says about, oh, you can't change the status quo at all, doesn't really make any sense. The motion says, this House believes that we should replace the current system with A. We say we don't believe that because we think we should replace it with B, which happens to be a lot more similar to the current system. I'm happy to say we can make small adjustments to the system without having to overhaul it completely. That's not against the motion. Secondly, I think that they're just exaggerating the degree to which you can actually abuse pharmaceutical patents in the United States and around the world. But I guess I'll say a few things for this. Firstly, the cost of being sued isn't that significant for the majority of companies for two reasons. One, they are also very large. Most pharmaceutical companies are very large companies, so they have large legal departments that are already equipped to deal with this. This is sort of a fixed cost that is in any case much lower than the cost of R&D. But secondly, because multiple people can do it, that is, if you wait for another pharmaceutical company to start producing the drug, that has in theory been patented, and you see that there hasn't been a successful patent, then you are able to do that as well, which is why when a patent expires, you are able to take advantage of it. But this isn't a first mover disadvantage, because if you are the first alternative competitor to produce a drug, you can still charge high prices for it and still make a profit. So the risks involved in having the fear of litigation are much smaller than the profit that you could potentially be made by violating a risky patent. But thirdly, inherent in the claim that you can change a patent is the claim that the old patent can now be used by other people. That is to say, the standard for creating a new patent is that it has to be reasonably different from something that has existed in the past, which means that the patent that has expired is definitionally not something that you can be sued for. Colin said this, they ignored it. So what this means is that all of their arguments about patent abuses and patents being held ad infinitum don't actually make sense. This affects the weighing of the debate in a very significant way, which I will make absolutely clear right now. We are happy to bite the bullet of 20-ish years where in a country, one particular drug is very expensive because it is better than the alternative of not having that drug ever developed in the first place. Why is that the alternative? For the very simple reason that the cash reward that they promise is largely take it or leave it. That is, if another company gets the drug before you, you're not going to get the cash prize. And importantly, this is the case if your drug is, say, 5% or 7% more effective than the other one. It's not that easy to just re-give a large cash prize for these things that have been done. And if the government hasn't promised it, then you, say, as an investor, can't trust that it is going to happen. So what that means is that it is much riskier on their world to actually do R&D. Comparatively, under our side, it's possible that someone else gets the patent before you, but if you patent another drug that you produced independently that is more effective in treating that same disease or say has fewer side effects, then you will still be able to make a lot of money. So on their side, the reward is binary. Either you get it or you don't. Under our side, there is more modulation, and that means that the risk that companies take is much smaller, which is why companies are so much more likely to actually invest under our side. This is what Colin tells you. So why is it that we prefer this? What is the actual weighing? Well, it's very simple. We prefer a world in which you save many lives in the long run after 20 years, even in their best case where these drugs are obscenely expensive, than a world in which all these future people die anyway. But a second point in the weighing here is that patents often depend on treaties or the limitations of national borders to actually be enforced. But a lot of developing countries don't have intellectual property treaties with rich countries, which means that they can literally produce these drugs without respecting the patent in developing countries. This is why the hepatitis C drug that was developed a few years back, which literally has saved millions of lives in the developing world, has been able to be sold for cheap because the US patent cannot be applied in a lot of countries around the world. That is a crucial bit of weighing. Second important point has to do with the role of insurers and government incentives and so on. So what they tell us is, well, if you have mesothelioma in the United States, no one cares about you, no one wants to produce a drug. Wait a second, every single person under the federal poverty line in the US is literally covered by Medicaid. What are they saying about, oh, the government doesn't have the money to pay these companies? They can. Even in the United States that has the most lenient regime in terms of the government isn't allowed to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies, which would mean that if companies were to produce this drug, it would be hugely beneficial for them in the status quo. The fact that it doesn't exist just means that it is too difficult to come up with in terms of R&D. Companies don't know what to do in order to create that drug. Drugs aren't just created instantly. The second thing they say is, well, we get more drugs to developing countries because that is literally what OG fiated at the beginning. I think this is a little bit abusive to say we're going to use quality around the world as opposed to within your own borders, which would be a more reasonable interpretation. But in any case, you have fiat power over the short term, but you need to prove that your policy is going to be sustainable in the long run. That is, that Congress isn't just going to overturn it in 5 years when you see that your government is dishing out 300 times the amount of money it's ever given to in foreign aid to developing countries in this law. Congress is going to overrule it in 5-10 years, and now you're going to have no patents and also no money for all of these drugs. So this doesn't actually make a lot of sense. I think in the present, yeah, I'll take a POI from CG. Go ahead. CG.
Things like Medicaid have ceilings. That is to say, if you're charging $250,000, the Medicaid office will literally let you die. I don't know how out of touch you have to be to not understand that there is an easy way to create ceilings on these kinds of drugs.
Actually, that is factually untrue. So for instance, there is a type of program covered under Medicaid, which is for people with late-stage renal disease, which costs people about $2 million per person, explicitly because Sarah Palin created this whole upheaval in Congress about death panels and ruled that US government institutions can't make decisions about the value of a human life. So that is empirically false. All right. Second impact in terms of why it affects developing countries is that even if developing countries have people that are generally poor, collectively, a lot of these people are in fact covered by the government, which means that the government can negotiate en masse with large pharmaceutical companies. They say, "Oh, how is it that these markets are viable markets?" Wait a second. If you're telling me the government cannot negotiate with companies to pay cash up front, how are they supposed to negotiate with companies in order to incentivize them to start developing drugs in the first place? In any case, it's much likely that companies just accept cash because they don't have the uncertainty of knowing, oh, what if somebody else gets to the drug first? Which is why negotiations between governments that cover most people in developing countries and pharmaceutical companies are more likely to be successful than their program. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. Very much